Welcome to our series about the ultimate BMW M3s. So far in this series we've driven the E30 M3 Sport Evo, the E36 M3 GT and the E46 M3 CSL. Can you guess what's next? This is the very exclusive, very orange E92 M3 GTS. On a very wet Castle Combe. The GTS was announced in 2009, 2 years after the release of the standard E92 Generation M3. Like the CSL before it, there is no motorsport homologation backstory, but it is by some margin the rarest of all the special M3s we have here. Philosophically, the E92 M3 GTS was a curious car in some ways. As soon as you get into this, it feels much more extreme than any of the other M3s that we've driven so far today. It's much more stripped out in here. It's louder, possibly not louder than the CSL actually, but that V8 up front, it dominates the car as soon as you get into it. But at the time, it was seen as a slightly curious car. They produced, as I say, just 135 of these. Some of them were, as you can see, right-hand drive, and they were sold for a huge amount of money. They were about £115,000, and it was a bit of a case of, well, why? I mean, yes, it was very extreme, but there was also a whiff of perhaps the parts bin about these. I mean, these Recaros, I love them. They're probably my favourite seats of any of the cars here, because they just hold you so well, but you can pick them up from Demon Tweaks basically. We've got a bolt-in roll cage at the back, that rear wing, still today it just looks a bit apologetic. But then other things, clearly BMW spent the money on. I mean, the engine, the standard M3 had a 4 litre, this was stroked by 362cc up to 4.4 litres, giving you another 30 brake horsepower. And you don't do that just for a parts bin special. The lightweighting too was pretty extensive. Obviously the rear seats went entirely and the front chairs became buckets, so to speak. But the centre console and door cards were lighter too, and there was also a titanium exhaust. The cage added a fair bit back onto the rolling total, but the glass in the sides and rear was replaced with Perspex. All in all, as long as customers didn't add a radio and aircon back into their personal spec, it totted up to an EU curb weight of 1,605 kilos. Which in broader terms is not that light, but is a useful 70 kilo weight saving compared to a DCT equipped M3 Coupe of the same vintage. So it was a curious car, but to be honest, as soon as you drive it, you just forget all of that. In terms of balance, well, if it's been moving progressively rearwards through the years, then this is perhaps the ultimate example of that. In this car, certainly in the wet, this is on a Corsa tyre, so we're on the Pirelli tyre now, instead of the Michelins that were on the CSL. This is all about trying to put the power down in this. Front end, you never have any questions that it's just going to dive straight into the corner, and that was the same on the standard M3 of this generation as well. But in this, you're always conscious of what's going on at the rear of the car. I remember when BMW announced that the E90 generation of M3 was going to have a V8 and not a straight six. After 15 years of M3s having straight sixes, it seemed like an odd thing really. But now, I mean, this naturally aspirated engine is just an absolute monster and truly wonderful. The S65 engine puts out 444 brake horsepower at a screaming 8,300 RPM and 324 pounds-foot of torque at 3,750 RPM. On a dry day, this means the GTS should be good for a 0 to 62 mph time of 4.4 seconds and a top speed of 190 miles an hour. I remember reading a report at the time that said that the DCT gearbox, because this now has a dual clutch gearbox as opposed to the single clutch gearbox from the E46 CSL, and I remember people saying that perhaps it didn't have the character of that single clutch gearbox, that SMG gearbox, but I have to say today I can't see why you would want a single clutch gearbox over this one because it is so much smoother, and particularly in the wet where you don't always want to be changing up right perhaps at the top end. This car is very much of the generation of cars that came out around now. It's talking sort of 997 era of GT3, and let's not forget this was a rival for the GT3, which it probably shouldn't have been, but it's so much fun. Another button that you've got in this car is this one, the power button, which gave you about another 100 brake horsepower and made it even louder in here. I suppose it was a bit like the sport button that we had in the CSL. In the way, you certainly don't really need the extra horsepower or the extra throttle response. Wow! You can just feel it slightly upset as it upchanged there in the wet. What a ride this car is. It feels the most extreme when you get into it, and it's the most extreme to drive. It's going to turn the gear shifts down a bit. You can change the aggressiveness of the shifts via this little button behind here.
The suspension was uprated with new KW springs and dampers, the latter individually adjustable for both compression and rebound. You can tweak the camber to your own preferences too, but this one is in its factory approved settings.
With the end differential in the back of this is actually slightly more progressive in terms of the way that it breaks away under power, but then again you've got that lovely M3 balance, but it feels perhaps not as settled once you are over the limit in this. You've got to be quicker, you've got to be more alert, but I love that. It's the most extreme of all the extreme M3s. I love it. You know when you've been tangoed. You know when you've been GTS'd.